Hello, I'm Alex, part of the Exeter Chiefs For Change team and an Exeter Chiefs season ticket holder. I am here to host a Q&A directly addressing the use by Exeter Chiefs Rugby Club of Indigenous Peoples imagery and the harm this does to their communities. We would like to make it clear that our focus is on the branding introduced in 1999 and not on the name Exeter Chiefs. I am very pleased to invite each of our guests to introduce themselves. Leandra?
Uda with Hambade, Umaha wa ubadi, Umaha ijaje wiwitate, Ambadagadi, Wache ijaje wiwitate, Leandra, Istashande wa ubadi, Wangi de weebnaha. So I want to introduce myself. My name's Leandra. I'm from the Omaha tribe of Nebraska. My Omaha name is Ambadagadi, which means this is a fine day or this is a very good day. I'm a ThunderClan woman and I belong to the Sky people. So I want to thank you all for taking this time to listen to us and to spend some time with us. Thank you.
Okay, Tony.
Chukma, I'm Tony. I am a citizen of the Chickasaw Nation, based in Oklahoma in the American Midwest, but originally from the Southeast. I have been in England since 2004.
Thank you. And Nick?
My name is Nicholas Hewlett. I hail from the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe on the Sloggy Nation. I was born here in Britain, as was my mother, and my grandfather moved over from that side of the world, from Turtle Island, in the 60s. And yeah, I think I've had a bit of a kind of unique perspective, having been born and raised here for much all of my life. So I wanted to kind of bring that here.
Thank you. And Stephanie?
Hello, my name is Stephanie Land. I'm like Nick, I was born in the UK. I have Native Alaskan heritage from the Inupiaq tribe. And again, like Nick, I think I have a unique experience of having mixed heritage. And yeah, I'm happy to share today. So thank you for having me.
Thank you. And Jimmy?
Howe dahe okashe ke tashe daras kahe da kashe ye do ekipshe kombra zani wami honipi kombra fahuska jaje abria. So my English name is Jimmy Lee Beeson II. So and then my Wajaje name is Fahuska. It means white hair. It goes back to the days of the so-called Indian Wars, and that means my namesake is from a battle in which a Osage man was going to scalp an American officer, and he pulled off his white wig, and then that became the name, and it got passed down. So that's the story behind my name, that I'm a part of that Big Hill band of Osages. And I currently teach at Haskell Indian Nations University, and still in Osage territory in Lawrence, Kansas. Yeah. So.
Thank you. And last but not least, Christopher.
My name is Christopher Ross. I come from the Anishinaabe people, specifically the Prairie Band Potawatomi, Kiowa on my father's side. I'm a member of Kododem, the Bear Clan people. My MC moniker is Prophecy, from the native hip hop crew Antithesis that we formed back in 2000 at Haskell Nations Indian University, where Jimmy and I had met. Basically, been working amongst our people with social justice issues and against the kind of things that we're about to talk about, and basically speaking out, putting out a clearer sound in words and actions based upon respect for Native and Indigenous peoples across the globe. So, Miigwech, thank you for the invitation to join you today.
Thank you very much. So we've received some really interesting questions. Thank you to everyone that took the time to submit these. Some questions were the same or very similar, so we've grouped them into topics for discussion, which we will start with. Then the remaining questions will make up a miscellaneous section to finish. So our first topic of discussion is honour versus harm. One of the most popular questions submitted was around the notion that using Native American branding is a way to honour and show respect to this culture. Some quotes that we can pull out both from the questions and from social media include, Exeter have total respect for American Indians, and those who believe differently are just ignorant, uneducated, and looking to cause trouble. The usage of the Native American in the Exeter Chiefs logo and brand is to honour and respect their cultural beliefs. So, what is your view on those that they say the branding is honouring and respecting Native Americans, and how misguided is this view? Your thoughts?
It's been something I've watched quite closely. I mean, in light of not only with the Exeter Chiefs, but this conversation's been going on in the United States as well with the Washington Redskins and other teams. And as I think that's one of the hardest arguments for me to understand. I have to say, as a Native American, I mean, I understand where someone may want to try to understand a history. But the idea of saying, well, we're honoring you without actually listening to people that they are apparently honoring doesn't quite add up. There's a disconnect to that. And so I think that I would take it back to those that are trying to honor, saying, if you're trying to honor us as Native peoples, then listen to Native peoples and what they're telling you, and also try to learn a bit more about the richness of our histories, because it goes beyond just one headdress or chants. It's a far richer set of cultures.
So to jump in, I think that this is still a manifestation of colonization, in that the same way that our lands and resources have been exploited for profit, the same way with our image is exploited for profit. At the end of the day, it's all about, capitalizing and commodifying our image in order to promote a brand, right? And none of that has anything to do with honor. Like Tony was talking about, if you really want to honor a people, you would actually take the time to learn about Native people. We're not one big single group. There's hundreds of different tribal nations. I looked at their statement and they talk about we honor the Native Americans, but that's a very generalized term and categorizes us as one big group of people. Although we are indigenous people, we have many different beliefs, many different protocols for different things, different ways of different ceremonies, different languages. So I think the fact that they're trying to say that they're honoring is disingenuous, and it has nothing, it does nothing more than help, the way I see it, individuals who are dealing with their own cultural amnesia, right? Because they've kind of embodied this fake imposter Indian identity, honestly, to kind of make up for their own lack of an identity, especially here in America. You look at how it was colonized and Europeans coming over and forfeiting their identity to become Americans. So along the way that they lost some kind of connection with themselves. They lost a connection to their original teachings, right? And so we are amongst the last colonized people. And I think people are infatuated with that, but they're also kind of repulsed by it. They want to take that identity the same way they took the lands and exploit it and use it for their own gain. Okay, so it has nothing to do with honor, it has everything to do with themselves. It has everything to do with what they want to do with that image. They want to control that image the same way they're controlling the lands, right? So that's my thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, just kind of going along with what Jimmy was saying, it's just really that kind of system of racial hegemony really being enacted in operation, and kind of using our cultural identities without our permission or without any sort of dialogue. When the Exeter Chiefs or the Redskins or the Cleveland Indians or whatever mascot is out there, I wonder, I guess it begs the question, how many of them actually reached out to Native communities and asked the question as to whether this was honoring us or whether this was something that we had even engaged in at all. You know, when we go and think about these kinds of power structures and in the places of privilege, it kind of really is pitting the dominant majority in this position of power and exploitation, as Jimmy says, and also a lot, you know, this kind of, you know, who's defining what's honorable to us. It certainly isn't Native people who are defining it. It's actually, you know, the non-Native or the white majority who are saying this is honorable and so therefore it is. But where where's that dialogue? You know, when we as Native people are saying this isn't honoring to us, it's kind of erasing that whole colonial legacy and the relationship of genocidal policies that have been enacted against us as people. And it really lacks acknowledgement of who we are. And, you know, again, you know, that kind of homogenization that's occurring, categorizing us as one one group that dresses in Plains headdress with a tomahawk chop, as if we all do that in each of our tribes, where, you know, we have all distinct traditional ways, we all distinct languages, cultural ways, and, you know, many of the tribes don't, you know, even use the headdress. So it's kind of, you know, really for me, the biggest thing is who's defining that honor, you know, because if you've got this kind of, you know, over 450 Indigenous activists, artists, businesses decrying this and saying this isn't an honor to us, but yet non-natives are saying, oh, but it is. I mean, you know, it really is kind of, you know, showing that racial hegemony that's happening and that's coming into play. So that's, you know, a big thing for me, is really that kind of seat of privilege is defining what's honorable to us.
And I think another part of that, just building on what Leandra was saying, I think it's also important to understand the history within, particularly within the United States. There's been a conscious effort by the American government to eliminate our cultures and eliminate our identities. There were boarding schools that Native children were taken to learn to become, quote, civilized. They were taken away from their language. They were shamed about who they were, their religion, their culture, their values, and told to actually behave in a very different way. So there was an explicit quote around saying to kill the Indian to save the man. But all of this thing around the mascots and such really comes in the backlight of that, is saying, oh, you know, we are, in essence, peoples of the past. Our identities are peoples of the past that we're just clinging onto, perhaps. But this is really what an Indian was, and this is where they fit within our society today. So that now we're just, in essence, mascots or other forms of identity. It's just taken away the richness and the fact that we are citizens of sovereign nations even today, with a very rich culture, language, history, a range of cultural diversity within that continent.
I'd like to add that we know there's published data that says the majority of Native Americans don't feel honored, and they say it's highly disrespectful. And there's other data out there that says it has severe harm, you know, particularly to Native youth. So, you know, the research says otherwise, that it's actually dishonorable and disrespectful.
I think it's very interesting how this all plays out, because in the West, typically, we're so big on copyright and ownership of things that we've created, so that people can't take that away from us or make money from it or whatever. That's a big part of contractual law that we abide by. In some countries, they don't abide by that at all. So I find it interesting that we're so capable of in the West of kind of adhering to this concept of patenting things and ownership of things. But when it comes to a culture of those who are oppressed, who have been oppressed. And our culture, there doesn't seem to be that kind of respect, that trying to seek permission. There's been no one asking for permission for these things. It's just take, and that's it. And it boils down to this whole concept of might makes right. And it's really hard to refute that this neo-colonialism exists. You can't refute that, because effectively the West is still benefiting from that concept of colonialism, which is the people who have dominated through violence and other means and deception are now creating the rules in which the oppressed minority have to abide by, and it all falls under this concept of being able to take when it suits and when it pleases. But yet this whole hypocrisy of copyright and ownership, intellectual property, cultural property doesn't seem to extend into that realm of things. So I would say, what honor is there in that? What honor in taking what is not yours and using it? Because if it was a piece of music, it would be taken to court and you would be sued and you would lose money. So what is at stake here, really? That's what I ask.
Yeah, the most important thing that we can always remember is that colonization was a fine-tuned weapon by the time it touched the shores over here on Turtle Island, and that it was something that was in practice for a long time across the sea before it reached us. The other thing that we have to remember is in one of our protocols as Native people, there are those of us who don't even refer to ourselves as Native Americans. That's a basic concept. That's reductive in nature. That's marginalization. That is taking an entire continent of people and reducing them down to something that other people are comfortable with, because they don't want to learn how to pronounce Potawatomi or Osage or Maha or Choctaw. They don't want to show that honor. They don't want to show that respect. And so they'll refer to us as American Indian and Native American, when we know that the name America itself is a product of colonization. It's for Amerigo Vespucci. It has nothing to do with our personal names. We all, as tribal people, have different names for this land that we're here on and we're born on and raised on. So much so that, it's even now a common precept in college, and I've watched it change. I've returned to college recently to finish up a couple of things. And when I first went to school in the 90s, the idea of the Bering Strait was commonly thought of basically as a theory. And now, returning back in this late part of the world, finding that it's an accepted fact to the majority of people. And so, even though there are plenty of things to refute that, there are plenty of things to say that, it's almost like a colonial history of saying, well, this is where you come from. This is where you are from. And our science has found that. And we know time and time again that science can be very wrong. So when we look at something like somebody saying to honor people, our protocol as Native peoples, Indigenous peoples, and tribal peoples, one of the things we seek to do when we honor somebody who's from another culture is we find out that what is honorable to them. If we wanted to give something just as like a token of esteem, a gift or something of that nature, we would find out what was valuable to that person. We would ask, seek some guidance. We would say, what would be a good gift for them? What do they value? And things of that nature. So to basically do as you wish with the image and identity of a people, and then never ask yourself the question, it's almost facetious. Again, as I stated in a meeting that we had before, there's no such thing as an accidental racist in the year 2020. We're in the 21st century. This is not something that you just go, oops, I was racist. I didn't mean to do that. I was trying to honor you. It's not that is selfish at best, immature and childish. It's just basically that you don't dress up in a people's culture and do fake chants and do these mockeries. And that's what it is. Tomahawk chop is a mockery. Fake songs are a mockery. Chants are a mockery. The face paint, mockery. A headdress, mockery. Something that shouldn't exist. It's literally mocking a people. And so when we look back and we look upon the history of mascots, I've had those simple conversations with some people, And I've just guided them down the path. One person who was a friend of mine, he really tried to defend some things. He's like, well, if you look, they're images of power. There's like a panther, there's like a buffalo, there's like, you know, and he went down the list and he kept going, and he goes, you know, they're like animals of power. And then I was like, okay, keep going, and we had to stop. Yeah, we're lauded in with beasts of power, you know, that are perceived that way. So to me, that says a lot about the people trying to convey that. And so again, you don't get to say what honors or dishonors the people whose culture you're making a mockery of. It's time to grow up. The world has to grow up. The world has to mature. We're dealing with things like, you know, this global pandemic that we're dealing with. And we have people that don't want to wear masks, you know, for their own reasons. So that's a dangerous train of thought to continue in this time, in this era, in this day, that there are people who will refute what is fact for another person based upon their own perception of what they think is important and what they don't. That marginalization is something that has to end. You have to take into account all parties involved. And so we're finding that continually, this is the thing that we run into when we deal with colonization, is there's these people who don't want to listen. They don't want to be educated. They don't want to seek further than their comfort zone. And the reality is we're dealing with a spoiled child who's throwing a tantrum saying, I want what I want, and I don't care what you have to say.
I think here in England, I would give a benefit of the doubt in the first instance, in the sense of that a lot of people in England are taught about Native peoples in the United States. They honestly wouldn't be. So there's just not the same level of public knowledge or awareness of us here as there should be in the United States. So to me, I start off with there is an educational piece and an awareness piece. In terms of the Exeter Chiefs, we are at that point now. They are going to make it, they are going to move from learning, making a conscious decision based on what Native peoples are telling them, based on what science is also telling them, in particular around the harm of imagery and so on. They are moving from learning to decision. And it's at that point that it does go beyond, I didn't know better. They are saying, I have heard you, I don't care, if they decide to continue with where they are. And that is very different. And I think that's very dangerous. What I would also add to this is that, at least from my sense of things, it feels to me that there's a greater tolerance of using Native peoples as mascots or themes than a lot of other marginalized people, other peoples of color. And I think that there has to be that question of why. Why would that wouldn't be accepted of many other groups, certainly in Britain, in modern Britain, we wouldn't accept it. It would be stopped. It would probably even fall within hate speech, depending on what's being done. Why is this acceptable? And the only thing I can think of is that there is a view, because people don't, in this country, that people don't know, there's an assumption that we've just assimilated. We are now part of a dominant America rather than being citizens of our own nations, being dual citizens, at least dual citizens. And so that we're a part of history. But the fact is, we are still here. Our cultures, our languages, our identities are here. They are strong. And so we have to be treated as much as any other peoples, and our culture is respected in the same way, but certainly not denigrated or just, in essence, just elements taken from it, saying, well, it's all good fun, or we're trying to honor you. It doesn't work for other groups. It can't work for us either.
So yeah, I think it's a problem with this whole concept of it almost is kind of like it's not a crime unless somebody catches you doing it, right? You know, and this is what I'm hearing sometimes, which is like it kind of comes together with this whole question of, well, you know, if there's nobody here to be offended by it, then what's the harm of doing it, right? Which is kind of like, it's beside the point. It's like that theory of, well, does a tree fall? You don't see it falling or hear it falling. You know, that's a perception on the people who are hearing it. But ultimately, the dialogue is still there about you as a person. you're doing something and you feel like it might not be right. And for the most part, I do believe that most of us as human beings have some concept of, especially now, like Christopher said, in the 21st century, we do have some kind of compass, some kind of reckoning that almost allows us to feel a certain way about what is right and what is wrong, you know, as rational human beings now. You know, it's something that you should think about when you're by yourself, when you're doing something wrong, you know, when you feel like you might be doing something wrong, you kind of you know, should I be doing this? And post after the fact, you know, when you've been caught, or feel like you may not have been caught as an individual, but you see something that might reflect on something you've done already, that there should be a thought in your head that's like, you know what, maybe I shouldn't do that, you know. So this kind of like, it's almost like a get out clause, where it's like, if nobody catches me from doing it, or it's not offending somebody in my sphere, is good enough. That's not good enough. That's really not good enough. As philosophical, critical thinking, rational beings now, it's not good enough to be like, I'll just you know, carry on doing this until somebody catches me doing it, or as long as it doesn't hurt someone. Because then you end up anyway. When it comes to a space where it might hurt someone, you get into that space and you're so desensitized to being to that harm, to that external harm to someone else, you're just going to do it anyway. And this is kind of what we're facing now with this branding of Exeter Chiefs, right? And I think now is a time where we sit down and we discuss and we say, well, where do we go from here on out? And if you don't have people in your circle, in your sphere that are Native Americans, you need to go find some, because there's not so little of us that you can't go onto the internet and find people, or find the nations, the tribes. Pretty much all federally recognized tribes have their own website. So, you know, the reason, they Google is your best friend. There's no reason for anyone to be ignorant now, when you can just get on your phone and be like, Siri, tell me this. There's a voice in your phone, an AI in your phone that will tell you answers to your problems. I'm with Christopher. There's no way that you could possibly claim to be that uneducated now. You know, aside from woeful kind of like ignorance or not willing to want to do it, which is a different problem altogether, right? It's about this critical thinking, and that's why I think this is something that we, as a generation, need to instill into our education, this critical thinking, this reflection.
Yeah, I've been real quick, just kind of going on what Tony and Christopher and Nick were all saying, just kind of in agreement, is, yeah, it really is. In the age of information, you know, this is the information age. We've never had so much information at our fingertips that now we are faced with, this is a choice. This is a choice that we're making. It's that cognitive dissonance that is occurring at the moment with regards to this imagery and this branding. And it sort of really goes into that kind of intent. And I guess for internal change to happen, they, you know, what we're trying to do here is to kind of show that correlation between causation. We as Native are saying, this isn't honoring to us. This is actually a mockery. It's denigrating us as people and reducing us down to one caricature of what people in a place of privilege are defining what is honorable and who we are as people. And it really just is a very one-dimensional approach, and just completely negates the three-dimensional lived experiences of all of us. So yeah, just kind of in agreement with that. It's really, you know, a choice now, especially in 2020, in the information age, where we've all got access to information. You know, it's no longer acceptable.
Okay, so our second subject for discussion is a closer look at Exeter Chiefs Rugby Club. As we know, Exeter Chiefs introduced the Native American branding back in 1999 and have expanded on it since then. From the logo and the images to the naming of the bars, the mascot Big Chief, and the tomahawk chop. When you see this, how does it make you feel? And would you attend a match at Sandy Park?
Um, I think when I see the mascot and hear the Tomahawk Chop and all of this, I guess I just try to. The biggest question to my mind is why. Like, why is that something that is so important to the team? What is it in their mind? What do they think that this helps with, and why do they think that that's at all acceptable? Where is it coming from? I think is what I would want to understand. So, to me, it's just more baffling than anything else. I just don't understand why they would want to. Why they would want to. Why they want to do this. In terms of going to see a match, I think it depends on what decisions they make going forward. If they decide that they want to still keep being the Chiefs in the sense that it is right now with this mascot and everything else, then no, because they're telling me very clearly they don't have any value at all for my native identity and or me. So why should I go?
I think it just goes back to what Chris was saying earlier again. It's just the reoccurring theme of lacking any kind of respect for Native people. It's just a mockery. There's no real. They're not even honoring actual Native people. They're honoring a fake idea of who Native people are. The whole tomahawk chop, because we have the same issue here with the Kansas City Chiefs, where by where I live, and it's the same thing, the same excuses. We're honoring you. We're doing this tomahawk chop to, I suppose, honor your warriorhood and the spirit of everything that happened in the past, which is kind of ironic in itself, because it's like we were like killing white people during colonization, so it's kind of like they're taking upon themselves to honor this, idea of a warrior or idea of who Native people are. And they always talk about these attributes of bravery, standing strong, all these things, but when actual Native people stand strong and are brave in their voice to want this to stop, they turn around and say, be quiet, get over it, and shut your mouth. And then that's the thing, is they don't want to acknowledge actual Native people. They're comfortable with the illusion of who we are, because if they acknowledge who we really are, then they would have to acknowledge the colonization. They would have to acknowledge what was done to us as a Native people. They would have to acknowledge we have the highest suicide rates in the country. They would have to acknowledge the land that was taken and the genocide that took place with Native people. That those are the real things that have impacted us in the past and up until today. So to them it's easier to identify with a fake imposter identity than it is with a real one, because with the imposter you don't have to acknowledge anything. You can just, it's like a toy, you can just do whatever you want with it, and I see that as just a continuation of that same paternalistic kind of that white paternalism, like, well, we know what's best for you, this is an honor, so be quiet, so.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly these cues as well that are kind of these social cues that are saturating society and, acting as propaganda as far as upholding the stereotypical structures, and it really influences and acts to educate in some respects, not in a good way, but basically, it deforms who we are as people. It's informing how people perceive us. And I think Jimmy and Christopher and I were on another sort of conversation about this kind of the ignoble versus the noble savage, the fancy dress costumes of the Pocahontas versus the Disney princess. There's these kind of dichotomous relationships that are occurring, this kind of both fearsome and loathsome relationship towards Native peoples, and how they perceive us. And it's really, I guess for me, would I willingly put myself in a position of going to Sandy Park to a rugby match, to be exposed to that? I think at this point, it would actually be almost like a re-traumatization. Even seeing the videos online, for me, I've just been filled with horror in seeing the mockery of it all, and the denigration of us. And I am a living, live Indigenous woman, and to see some of those things occurring, it really just kind of slaps you in the face, really, with the colonialism of the I guess the hubris behind it is really kind of offensive to me. So I guess if it was a different scenario where we were attending a match and they were open to dialogue and to education and awareness around this issue, and open to changing this, it would be a different thing. But currently, as it stands now, I don't think I could put up with putting myself in that situation of going to a rugby match and having to be exposed to that.
I think it's very interesting to see, for me personally, the logo and the mascot, because I have feelings of not nostalgia, but not in a good way. From someone who comes from a Cuban and also a Caribbean descent background, like being in Britain, I've seen the decline in the use of appropriation of cultural objects and icons, and the way that we as a country operate in regards to each other and our relationships, especially particularly with African descent, and just typically diasporas that are a minority in the country. And it's interesting to see that things have changed in that respect, but in a lot of ways haven't changed at all. It's no longer acceptable to have to own a gollywog. It's no longer acceptable to use blackface. It's no longer acceptable to run around, pretending you have a spear, wearing bones and painting up like you're a Zulu warrior. It's no longer acceptable to do those things. It hasn't been acceptable to do that for a long time. And I saw that change, and I've seen in people that change, that in my friends and stuff, about how we approach each other and the care and consideration in which we do it. And my question is why is this not extended to the other part of my culture? Why is this still acceptable for Native Americans, or from Indigenous people from Turtle Island and from our tribes? Why is that still acceptable when in other cases it wouldn't be? And it fills me with a kind of regret in a lot of ways, that I thought that things had somehow changed, because in actuality they haven't. It's just become this situation again of, we could get caught appropriating from people of color, of Caribbean descent or African descent or whatever. We can get caught, and there can be serious repercussions from doing that. But okay, let's find somewhere else to do it. Because I'm asking, in particular, what exactly is so easy to access and so iconic about these logos and these mascots? Why is that choice for that? This stereotypical indigenous head of someone from Turtle Island, of a Native American, or American Indian, as some people like to call us. What is it exactly that's so iconic, so great about that in particular? When there's many other things, many knights, there's Vikings, from which many people and from Britain have lineage from. There's Celtic, there's Gaelic. When I see it in some of my Welsh friends as well, actually there is still this underlying element of appropriating and oppressing minorities of indigenous heritage. And so that leads me to think, well, no, I would not go and see Exeter Chiefs play, because for as long as that mascot and that logo exists, I would never be able to feel safe and feel respected within the confines of the playing grounds. I would just be filled with rage and ire, because I don't want to see that, really. And I don't think there's any difference from years way back, 30, 40 years back, where we had to watch minstrels dress up like people of African descent. You know, if I saw that on TV now, boy, you know, the whole country would be up in arms, as you can see clearly even now. So no, I wouldn't go and see a rugby match for as long as that logo still exists and that brand still exists for Exeter Chiefs.
I have 2 young children, and you know, who are born and raised in this country. You know, as a Native American, I am teaching them my Chickasaw culture to pass that on to them and giving them a connection. And so we talk about, you know, Native related issues quite a lot in our family and parts of my culture. So I think about, well, if I guess the question to me is, would I take my family? Would I take my children? And then they're saying, oh, well, who is that? Is this what we do as Native peoples as well? And it's like, no. And how to have those kind of conversations. I've been able to avoid that. So I wouldn't want to have to start it now, especially when they're that young. I would rather them have to deal with it not at all. But if they do have to deal with it, then when they're much older and a bit more aware of the world and can understand and interpret what's going on and also right and wrong.
Absolutely. I mean, Tony, I want to thank you for that, because you do bring up a very important point, is our children. You know, we have to look at our native world and understand, as Indigenous peoples, we have the highest rate per capita of suicide amongst our native youth. And so, you know, one of the things that I embarked on when I took on practicing the hip hop culture and trying to spread the message and the culture of our people through hip hop music, one of the most important things I knew is how that was going to affect the self-esteem of our native youth. You know, because there has always been a call since I've grown up, you know, to do suicide prevention for native youth. And there's a lot of people who are engaged in that across the country. There are all kinds of social programs. There are people whose entire lives are dedicated to keeping native youth from killing themselves, essentially. And so we have to look at the harmful images and things that are portrayed, and the lack of representation and positive representation in the media. It seems like we're forever trapped in this scope of around the 1800s or contact era, you know, and in that we're not allowed to evolve as a people to be who we are today. And I don't mean by any means that we're evolved as in better. We're actually devolved in some sense, and that's why a lot of us are engaged in decolonization, because we want to get back to those original understandings of our people, that original culture that we had that was very pure, very good, very well-intentioned in every aspect of life and respecting earth and everything upon it. And so this call for our native youth is very important, because there are not many of us to begin with, but if we look at the negative imagery that's out there through those types of things, I couldn't imagine ever taking my daughter. I have a 15-year-old and I have an 11-year-old, and I can never imagine them taking them into a coliseum like that. And after everything that I've taught them about their culture my entire lives and told them how they are going to be continuing that on for the next 7 generations and how important that is for us as a people, I couldn't imagine subjecting them to those images and those things and those people in general that say that they're honoring us. And in fact, they're doing such a damaging thing, because this is a constant continuation of a cycle with the mascot issue. It's something that you keep having to repeat. It's something you keep having to say. And again, I think it was Leandra that used the term re-traumatizing. And it is a constant re-traumatization. We're not allowed to go beyond this point. And even worse is these people are almost, how you would say, strategic in their efforts to maintain that imagery. It's almost as if it's purposeful, because you always have this thing where they'll pull out some native person or some person with native ancestry, or somebody who's even questionable about their native ancestry, say, oh, I'm not offended by it. I don't have a problem with it. And that's fine. But once we understand colonization, we understand that there are people who suffer from Stockholm syndrome. There are people who will not feel any type of way because they just want acceptance. You know, there are people who just don't want to create waves. There are people who are so detached from their culture that they don't have the affinity for it that some of us have. And so it's easy to find somebody like that and grant them small favor. You know, one of the worst things that I saw during this whole course of the Washington team's thing is when they dragged out code talkers and brought them to the stadium. You know, that was totally exploitive in nature. And it was, but again, strategic. If anybody's ever played chess or anything else of that nature that requires strategy, you look at it, it's very strategic. So this isn't something that's happening accidentally. This is not something that's in that way. So if we have to look at that, we have to ask ourselves, what is the very intent behind that? And the very intent behind that is we are colonization's guilty conscience. Britain has to come to the terms that the problem with America, because it's easy to look, I'm sure in the UK, there's a lot of fingers being pointed at America and pointing out how idiotic we look right now. And I'm not from this place. I'm not a United States citizen. You know what I mean? I'm from my people. We are subject to an illegal occupation by an entity that just has more military might that we can't repel. That's the reality of it. Britain is the home of that. This is the descendancy of that. This is the legacy of the UK. And so when we look at that, there has to be people that come to terms with that understanding, that everything that we're subjected to is because of that. And there's a responsibility there. There's a means of undoing things. We have to look at campaigns. If you look at the campaigns that Hitler launched against Jewish people, you look at the propaganda and the pictures and the big noses and things of that nature. When you're allowed to dehumanize a people on that level, then it's easy to marginalize them to people that you want to affect in that way. We are the guilty conscience of America. As long as America is looked at by the rest of the world, we're the ones who can stand up and go, they don't abide by laws. They're not a lawful people. They've abrogated every treaty, which they're in their constitution says it's the supreme law of the land. I can't think of any terms that would explain it better. The supreme law of the land. And so these treaties were made with that understanding, and they've abrogated every single one. They violated every single one. Again, if you were to enter into a contract in this day and age, and you were to put a gun to somebody's head or kidnap their children and hold them at another place and say, until you sign away the city of Los Angeles, you can't have these back, or we will do the most amount of harm that we possibly can. Well, that's under duress. So every one of those treaties was signed under duress. There's no way, there's even business deals. If somebody has a drink of liquor and they sign a contract, they can go to court and have that entire contract undone. So if Canon buys Sony and there's liquor involved, you can go to court and say, you know what, I was under duress at that time. And it would nullify the entire contract. So when we look at these things and we look at the marginalization and we look at things like missing murdered Indigenous women and how that became an actual thing to where it is totally omitted that our women are disappeared at one of the largest rates, and there's not a lot of investigation behind it. There's not a lot of effort into it. It's basically our people looking for ourselves. We are constantly having this situation where these marginalizations are very, very damaging and continually damaging through generations. And it's something that we're having to continue to fight. And it's something that we have, and it really boils down to is we are trying to convince some of our people to actually live. And so when we look at these types of attitudes, it really is an attitude that we're dealing with of, I will do what I want, I'll use your imagery how I see fit, and we're having to argue for that. We're actually having to argue that. When it's known globally, like it's unacceptable globally to show up in blackface, right? Like people will lose their jobs, people will lose their careers. Like it's a universally accepted notion that blackface is bad, but red face isn't. So we have to ask ourselves, why is it when these games are being played that it's acceptable to show up in red face?
I'd just like to say I'm a massive rugby fan. I have a season ticket to Murrayfield for the Scotland games. Occasionally go to the Edinburgh matches as well, but I will not go and watch an Exeter game if they came up to Edinburgh. I find the behaviours of the fans and the imagery offensive, and I think, like Leandra said, re-traumatizing. I think it really does have a visceral reaction. So you won't see me watching Exeter down in Sandy Park or in Murrayfield. It's horrifying. It's cringeworthy. It's just like what everyone's been saying about looking at old TV programs, you know, from the 60s and 70s in the UK that had unfortunate images of blackface or other along those lines, and it's just not acceptable anymore. And yeah, I just think it's we need to change this. And it's, yeah, why is it acceptable that blackface we definitely don't accept, and that it's okay to have war paint on and red face? It's a very interesting question. But yeah, you won't see me watching Exeter, sadly. I'm a big rugby fan. I love watching rugby, but I can't do it. It's too difficult with that going on around me. Literally, you know, being surrounded by fans doing those songs, those war cries, tomahawk dance, you know, whatever it is. No, it's a no from me.
So a lot of people have actually asked specifically about the headdress. One of the questions was, please can you explain a bit of history and the importance around the headdress, and how when sports fans use it, it detracts from the true meaning, and why it isn't appropriate to wear it as fancy dress?
Well, I think, you know, looking back and, you know, talking with my wife, who's a Assiniboine in Grovant, and her explaining the headdress, you know, all those feathers are earned. They were earned for certain things. And when people are making a mockery of that, I'm pretty sure everyone is familiar with stolen valor. I mean, would you be okay with soldiers standing on, you know, a corner or somewhere wearing a fake Purple Heart and asking for money? You know, things like that. So it's a form of stolen valor. You know, in my opinion, it's a way to kind of use something in order to gain something else. And like I said, you know, these places, the imagery, the headdress imagery, it's just reaffirming the brand. And I think that, you know, as long as the headdress issue is still out there, yeah, to me, it's a form of, it's again, taking that identity and, you know, misappropriating it, misusing it for their own gain, right? So.
And if Exeter Chiefs asked you, how can we celebrate your culture? What could that look like, if anything, rather than the mascot and the headdresses and tomahawk chop? Is there an appropriate way of doing it?
Well, for one, they can stop doing the tomahawk chop. And the other one is, I mean, there's a lot of looted, you know, as far as like looted ceremonial items that have found their way overseas. You know, advocate for the return of those items, the repatriation of those items, you know. The same way with the way our identity has been looted to an extent. The same way that, you know, different archaeological digs have found, you know, pottery, sacred pipes, things like that, you know, back in the 1920s, and things found their way over in different museums in Europe. You know, why aren't they advocating for the return of those items to the indigenous people, you know, in North America and South America? You know, I mean, it's really easy to just sit there and throw on a headdress and eat nachos and guzzle beer and say, oh, I'm honoring you. But when it comes down to actually doing the real work, volunteering, advocating for land back, advocating for tribal sovereignty, repatriating items, actually trying to understand and read about the people, even going to those communities and understanding what's happening. You know, how many of these people who say they're honoring Native people have helped out with masks and protective gear because of COVID? You know, how many of these people who say they're honoring Native people have donated to impoverished Native communities so that they can be protected during this time and have the tools they need to make it through alive? You know, I haven't seen anybody doing anything substantial as far as honoring anyone, you know. And until you see that, it's just disingenuous, and, you know, they're not truly honoring anyone. You know, it takes work to honor someone. Like Chris was saying, it takes, you know, you have to understand what it is they want. And a lot of Native people who want our identity to stop being a source of exploitation. One is land back, one is recognition of tribal sovereignty, another one is repatriation of items, another one is bringing light to the missing and murdered Indigenous women. So there's all these issues that we face, but nobody's doing anything substantial to honor us on that level. They just throw on a headdress and say, oh, I'm honoring you, and I'm going to sit here and watch the game and drink my beer and eat French fries. But yeah, there's nothing honorable behind that. There's nothing. It's just laziness. It's just an unwillingness to listen combined with laziness and cognitive dissonance all rolled into one. So if anybody wants to do anything to honor Native people, they can come over here and they can volunteer. They can read a book. They can do all these things and get involved and advocate on behalf of Native people if they really want to honor Native people. So, and
there are other. Well, I mean, I guess for me, there's a question. I'm grateful that they would want to honor us and help us, but where does that? I still kind of want to know where that comes from. Why particularly us? But as Jimmy is saying, I think any kind of help, if they genuinely want to go, and there are ways of doing that. There are ways of working with tribal nations and saying, well, what kind of help do you need? I don't know, maybe giving a certain portion of proceeds or donations to help with nations, like, for example, in education or dealing with health and, the pandemic, and or trying to raise awareness of missing and murdered Indigenous women and other issues that are very important to Native people. So there's a way of, and also even education if they want to. So how, again, working with Native peoples and Native nations, with saying, okay, well, how do we raise awareness around the influence of Britain on Native Americans, but also around the influence of Native Americans on Britain? I mean, going back into the history, we state visits, particularly colonial time when the British were trying to build relationships and, of course, pursuing their own ends. But there were state visits here. So trying to understand a bit more about that. I mean, I was just doing research recently around Chickasaws who had actually fought in the Jacobite Rebellion. No one knows about that, or very few do, but it's there. So we actually played a direct role in British history, continuing to affect Britain today. And we look at the fight for Scottish independence and debates going on there. So Native peoples had a role in that as well. So there are lots of opportunities, I think, to try to understand the history and the influence of Native peoples on Britain today. And there are also ways where the Exeter Chiefs as an organization can directly help with Native peoples. But again, they have to do it not in a way of saying, well, we're going to help by, but actually listening to Native peoples, listening to Native nations, and asking, how can we help? What can we do? And then working with them to do that.
Yeah, I would kind of echo, similar things along with what Jimmy and Tony were saying. I mean, even going back to that kind of headdress and, appropriating our culture and it's really that erasure of history and people attempting to pretend for a few hours, but not really having to ever grapple with the same realities that we've had to, as Jimmy mentioned, like high suicide rates, poverty, the missing and murdered Indigenous women. Our women are being targeted, and having to deal with the ongoing stigmatization of Native peoples. And it continues to really, with the headdress as well, continues to place us in this historical context where we're, riding around on horses in buckskin, living in teepees, when, as was mentioned previously, that isn't a reality for every single tribe throughout the United States or North America. And I guess, it really kind of shows that position of privilege in that, the rules don't apply to you. And, when we think about our Native religions, and our ceremonies being outlawed, or, the boarding school trauma, intergenerational trauma, how that comes into play with and impacts us as people, and, having our cultural identity stripped, You know, it just really is, you know, turning, you know, when you think about the headdress, I guess it's turning something that is sacred to us into something cheap. And, you know, along with honoring, if you really want to honor, I mean, I echo the same as what Jimmy was saying, you know, educate yourself on who we are as people. What was the colonial legacy that was established with Britain and Indigenous peoples, and really support Indigenous artists, you know. There are so many people misappropriating what they call inspired by natives, you know, artwork out there, jewelry. There's spiritual misappropriation, things, you know, these kind of new age hippie sweat lodge ceremonies that are popping up. You know, if you really want to honor us as Native people, I mean, come to us, ask to, you know, us, you know, look to you know, Google, as somebody said. There's loads of information out there, but, you know, there's a lot of avenues of and ways of honoring us that don't involve this re-victimization or this constant assault on us as people.
Yeah, I would say if you want to help, if you want to celebrate our culture, then you really need to be helping us celebrate our culture, because right now it's hard. There's many tribes out there who are federally recognized, and there's many who aren't federally recognized, and for a lot of tribes, it's a struggle just to even educate the youths, educate in an environment of our own culture. You know, being able to do that, getting back ownership of our language after everything with the boarding schools, you know, retracing our heritage, you know, like our tribe in particular, Mashpee 1.0, we had to translate a Bible just to be able to get some semblance of what our language used to look like, you know. So if you wanna celebrate our culture, you have to let us celebrate our culture first, and that is in, you know, in more than just words and imagery. That's about action. Like Jimmy said, you know, if someone's got cancer, you don't just post up pictures of them and or dress up like them. No, you give money, or you raise awareness, you help fight it. You know, that's what you do. You look for systems in which you can use to help that person who has been afflicted by through means of support. And then that's the best way to celebrate someone's life. You know, that someone's culture. You know, for, you know, like a birthday. When you celebrate someone's birthday, go to them and you let them know how much it is you appreciate them. You don't parade as them during their birthday. No, you go and you give them gifts, and you find out what it is they need. You find out how it is they're feeling. You find out what's plaguing them, and you celebrate their life as a birthday because you appreciate them being there. And if you want to talk about honoring and celebrating a people, you have to have that same approach. You have to ask us how it is we're doing. You have to ask us how is it's done. You have to say to us, we really value you. You have to make us feel like we're valued. You know, which is something that we don't really feel in this new Western world, this post-colonized world. You know, there isn't much value for us, and this is what it all boils down to. Again, with this mascot and this logo, there's no value in it. There's only value in it for the people who are using that, utilizing that for financial gain or for gravitas. You know, and it's about that. If you want to celebrate and you want to value someone, then you have to do that. You have to put action behind that. You have to find ways of valuing it. So go and find education. Go and volunteer. Go to these charities, and when our tribes are having lengthy court cases, which are hefty procedures, you know, find how you can support. Find out how you can give money, and what you can do in order to educate yourself, in order to support us and sustain us in that way. If that's what you want to do, if you really want to celebrate our culture, you have to celebrate us, for sure.
Absolutely. I just want to thank Nick for those words right there. You know, to celebrate our culture, you have to celebrate us. I mean, one of the things we have to look at is when we look at historical change of mascots and names, one of the things I always bring up when these discussions come up is the fact that the NBA team for Washington used to be Washington Bullets. And after a certain period of time, there was a time in DC where young men of color were being killed nightly by gun violence. And the community found it offensive that the team's name was Bullets while their children were dying by those bullets. And so there became this serious discussion, and it became really imperative. And it was acknowledged that, yeah, we probably need to change the name of this team so it doesn't inflect such a tone. And the NBA did it rather fast. And so it seemed like almost overnight, it went from the Washington Bullets to the Washington Wizards. And guess what, guys? They survived it. They survived it. You know, they even Michael Jordan even played for them. Okay, greatest basketball player in the world, played for the Washington Wizards. So you can survive changing the name, and the Washington Wizards are testament to that. So that is one of the things that needs to start right away. Is like let's just change the name. You know, it's the 21st century. It's really a name change. People who have the gear now are not going to miss out because people who enjoy sports will buy the current gear. They've survived color scheme changes. They've survived logo adaptments. They've survived many things. Look at the Seattle Seahawks. Compared to when I grew up, the Seattle Seahawks looks like an entirely different team in uniform. And guess what? They survived it, you know? So this idea and this notion that things are set in stone and are, you know, impermeable and can't change, you know, has been proven wrong. You know, so the first thing first, when you want to talk about what you can do, you know, is change it. Change the name. Be bold, be brave, be an adult. You know, there's a time where you have to just look at it in any situation, in any relationship. If you've committed a wrong, the adult and mature thing to do is say, I didn't realize I was doing that. And I'm sorry, because that hurts you. And so let me rectify that. And that's the change behavior, because apology means nothing without change behavior. And that's what's required here is change behavior, to say that, you know what, we're not only going to change the team's name, but we're going to invite Indigenous consultants in to figure out how we can help, you know, because we've done some harm. And so, you know, we'd like to, you know, and be able to sit there and understand it, because again, this process involves a humanization of our people. You know, that's why we're here today, is to put these faces and these struggles to a human perspective, because the reality is the majority, I mean, a lot of people only pick fights they can win. And that's why there's native mascots. You know, they know, you know, what we've been subjected to. They know what we've been through historically. And they know that, you know, there's people who believe we're extinct. There's people who believe that we're not around to argue. And that's why it's acceptable. You know, you look at a situation where Nick Cannon was making some statements in the media, and the minute it was deemed anti-Semitic, boom, anti-Semitic League was right there. You know, and so when you have the population, you have the political power, you have the economic power, then there's a means of saying, okay, that's not acceptable. Change was created immediately. Nick Cannon no longer has a job. I'm not saying I agree one way or another on the subject. I know that's just the thing that's recent in news as of this week. So we need those types of changes to occur ASAP, you know, and not like, oh, we're going to begin the process of it. Like what we're doing with, you know, Washington and Dan Snyder, who was just literally, it took everything, a pandemic, Black Lives Matter, the death of Freddie Gray, everything happening all across the globe, all the global support against racism for Washington to even consider this happening. Had these circumstances not existed, that wouldn't have happened. Dan Snyder was not going to allow it. And so we have to look at the change with the Chiefs here, the chieftains, you know, what is it going to take? What is it going to take? You know, and so we ask that these people understand and regain some sense of humanity, and say we're no longer going to contribute to the genocide of Native people, because that's essentially what it is. When you make a mockery of a people's culture, you are considering, you are not contributing to the legacy of genocide. You are basically contributing to genocide. It's a continual process, and it's still happening. Native people die 40% more than any other people on the United States continent. And that's an actual traceable fact. So when we look at that situation, those circumstances and things of that nature, make a contribution in that sense. And let's start to figure out how to help other than that, other than just changing a name. Let's get past that point. Let's get into being proactive. I mean, you know, the Irish led by a really good example by making a major donation to the Choctaw during this time right now, when we had the pandemic being on set, and sending their donations that they did to the Choctaw Nation as they received donations from the Choctaw Nation during the potato famine. We have to build these reciprocal relationships of help and aid as a global community. And this is part of the things that can start that process. But again, it can't be a process that lasts another, 20, 15, 10, 5 years. It's something that needs to occur now.
Yeah, I just want to say really quickly on that, Christopher brings up a great point with regards to the Irish, that reciprocity of exchange. It really established a level playing field as far as establishing mutual respect between two different cultures. And I think that's really key to what we're trying to do here, is how can we open up that dialogue and create that mutual respect and understanding for each other. And let's change it. What are we waiting for? Why is it even taking this long? Why are we even debating this?
Okay, so we're now going to move on to a selection of more specific questions. So the first question is, what's the response to Native Americans that say they aren't offended by the use of your culture by sports teams?
It's a good question, and there are Native Americans who don't feel offended, or they will say that they don't feel offended by it. And it's something that does hit quite close to home for me. I grew up in Oklahoma. My primary school was known as the Indians as a school team, and so it was just always there, and there were other people, other native students there, non-natives, and so on, and it was just part of life. And so growing up, I didn't really have a problem with it, but it was when I actually moved from the US to the UK, I became an immigrant here, and as you start to learn and become part of another nation, you start learning a bit more about your own, and you see it in a different light. Than if everyone around you is the same as you. If everyone is American around me, then I wouldn't have really thought about it in the same way. And then I think there's an extension of that from my American side, obviously my Native American side, and the richness of my own family within my nation. And so I was thinking around that, and the hard part of that is that I look back, and it goes back into, well, why did it take me until I actually moved to the UK, and really after my father died about 10 years ago, suddenly, for me to actually start saying, wait a minute, there's a lot that I actually don't know about. And I think a lot of that actually, or not a lot of it, but a good amount of it comes from that simple part of, well, this is what an Indian is, this is what they look like, this is what they do, and it just wasn't something that I connected to, the headdress and things, that wasn't part of my own tribal culture as anyway, and so it just wasn't something that I could really connect to. It was really after I had moved across, and then started to learn more, and also again being an immigrant myself, and then naturalizing as a citizen here. And so it was all of that that I started to realize how much of a gap that I had growing up, and so I've spent a lot of time trying to understand more about my Chickasaw culture and history, and also thinking, when I had children, thinking around how to pass that on to them and make them feel as proud of being Chickasaws as they are British, and that's what I want to do. So it's around being able to teach that culture, but it's so much richer than some high school's mascot, or some marching band song or chants or the like. It is so infinitely richer than that, and so I think that there's an extent that maybe some of I guess I would ask those, my fellow natives who aren't so bothered, maybe to think a bit more about that, or at the least to recognize that actually there are a lot of native peoples who are, who do take offense to this, and it does affect them consciously, and probably most dangerously, unconsciously. So that's what I would say back to them.
So I think a lot of natives who support these mascots, I think there's this type of, we've been so marginalized socially that we're practically invisible. UCLA puts out a diversity report, and the last one they put out a couple of years ago, there is 0.5% on-screen film representation for Native people. We're like 2% of the population. So out of a population, at least in the US, of 380, I believe 308 or 80 million people, there's about 5 million people who identify as being Native. We don't have really well-known actors. I do this kind of exercise with my classes. I'm like, can you name, off the top of your head, list off a white superhero, and then now list off the top of your head, a Native superhero, a Native actor, anyone except Adam Beach, and nobody can really think of anyone, so we are really marginalized in the media. We don't get a lot of recognition when it comes to things. So I think a lot of Native people really believe that when they see this imagery and these icons, they really think about it as almost they do maybe think about it as a form of respect, because we're so marginalized that they're willing to endure and overlook the racism just to be recognized. And that in itself is a problem and speaks to how marginalized we are. If some Native people are willing to tolerate racism in order to be seen, and that's kind of the issue right there. There was even that study that Crystal Eckelhawk and her organization put out, that public schools don't discuss Native people past the year 1900. Again, that's right after the 1800s, so still kind of stuck within this 1800s vibe, and basically nobody's seeing past that. So I think even within ourselves, because when I was younger, as a teenager, I remember feeling, like, oh, I'm gonna wear the Redskins hat and this Indian thing because that's all we had in a sense. But as I got educated on the topic and started to understand what was really going on and how the fans behaved, especially the opposing teams who create effigies and hang them or burn them or scalp them and all that stuff, that just didn't fly with me anymore. I started to really understand, like, wow, this is just leading to, more problems, and there's been studies, a lot of studies, even the American Psychological Association has put out a statement back in 2006 saying that these mascots need to be taken down immediately. But again, going back to Native people liking it, I think it goes back to, we're so marginalized that there is a population of Native people who think that any recognition is good recognition. Whether or not it's a mascot or something, they feel like, it's, we're being seen in some way. And I really think that they themselves are, even within our own communities, need to be educated on these topics, because that goes back to the lack of resources and schooling, even within our own communities and reservation communities, rural areas where a lot of Native children aren't getting certain things like that. They're not getting teachers who may be educated on these things and discussing them. And then also there's another aspect of it too. I think, there's kind of that disconnect, kind of anecdotally, when I talk to a lot of students, a lot of them that don't have an issue with it, kind of tend to be somewhat disconnected from their culture and their community. So they kind of don't really think about it like that, because, things like feathers, things like that, those are still a big part of our identity, and there's certain ceremonies. And that's a source of strength for us. And when we see our source of strength being mocked, those who are within the community, you're offended. It's insulting, disrespectful, So I think a lot of natives who might feel, oh, I'm not offended by that, they don't have that certain connection with that culture to understand what it feels like to be mocked, So that's just my thinking on that.
I think it's a man who is starved will eat anything in order to feel full, or to be sated. And I think it's appropriate in this context, although kind of hyperbolic, to know that as Native Americans, we have very little in terms of respect or feeling human when it comes to other people perceiving us. And so for a lot of people who are just looking for strength, looking for acknowledgement, looking for respect, like Tony and Jimmy said, it will effectively take something that's even backhanded or something that they know isn't wholly acceptable or isn't necessarily 100% beneficial, just as long as it gives a little something, just a semblance of what it feels like to be respected or humanized by someone else. We know modern psychology will tell us that through Stockholm syndrome and brainwashing and enough trauma will lead somebody to do things that are inexplicable and not rational, just so that they can survive. And that's what we're talking about, really, is survival. Wherever you want to look at, like Chris said, suicide rates are high, murder rates are high, rape rates are high, sky high for the concerned percentage of population that we have. And so, it doesn't surprise me when I hear from anyone of any culture, but in particular Native Americans who will say that they're not offended, because there's so many deeper, complex layers than that can even be explained in one answer here and now. We're talking about 400 years of psychological indenture to people that hated us and tried to eradicate us. I mean, what would you do? What would you do to ensure the survival of your children? I don't think there's any limit to what you would do to ensure the survival of your children and your people.
Yeah, I would just add to that, again, going back to, the assimilation and colonization process, the acculturation process that was happening in our boarding school systems, where our language was taken away, our ceremonies, our cultural ways, our traditional style of dress was taken away, and we were completely sort of organized in such a way that it was the white dominant majority narrative, the Eurocentric narrative, that we had to speak English, we had to adopt English names, we had to adopt English styles of dress, and this really created this system that had ripple effects down into the children and the generations following. And so there's a lot of people, I think, with Indigenous identity that kind of struggle and have that disconnect. And so, as Jimmy was saying, media is what's informing a lot of people, and that's why symbols and imagery are so powerful, because that's informing for many who don't have those cultural connections, what Native is, or what it means to be Native. And there's this kind of confusion that happens, and it really does come down to that level of colonization and disconnect. For many people, even within our group here in the UK, they're looking at reclaiming, or I guess revisiting and reacquainting themselves with their Indigenous roots, and trying to understand that process and what it means to be Native. But when you're constantly bombarded with these images in the media and through sports events of this is what Native America means, or what it means to be Indigenous, is quite damaging. It's harmful. And again, going into kind of Stephanie Freiberg's research on Native mascots and the American Psychological Association, there's just a whole plethora of information out there. Again, going back to our earlier conversation, that there's just no excuse anymore for us to be having these kind of conversations. Now's the time to change that. But yeah, that's what I'd like to say on that.
Okay, so our next question is, how do the people fighting against the idea of change make you feel?
Again, I think it's just foolish, lacking education, not wanting to change. There's no excuse in 2020 to not know why this is offensive. I just feel like, just an unwillingness to listen, and just kind of, plug their ears and, kind of act like it's not an issue. I also think it kind of goes back to that type of, what we see, this is kind of still a form of colonization, mining our identity for selfish reasons. So I think that in itself, this unwillingness to change is just goes back to just the ignorance, not wanting to change, not wanting to listen. There's not much more you can say other than that, that they're just being foolish about it and not wanting to listen.
Yeah, it's ironic, looking from the outside in, Jimmy and I are personal friends and have been so since the year 2000 when we went to school together at Haskell Indian Nations University, where he's currently a professor. And so, he's dealing with what he's dealing with there, educating, young Native people on culture and things of that nature. But watching him, as someone I consider a brother, it's really hard to watch, when he's dealing with things like the Kansas City Chiefs and knowing him, his wife, and his family, and then understanding the vitriol that comes when he posts about those things, and seeing that he's actually had to deal with death threats, from people because of him stating fact. I mean, they're arguing with a Native professor. Let's just say that right off of the top. They're arguing with a Native professor about whether a mascot is or isn't disrespectful. And so those ambiguous terms like, Chiefs, Kansas City Chiefs, they use that, and well, we're not using Native American imagery, and yet the people are dressing in headdresses, and all kinds of stuff that comes with that, and it's allowed in the stadium. So when you see that active resistance to it, you have to ask yourself, well, how does that couple with we're trying to honor you? Are you? Is that your intent? If somebody says maybe that's not the way to go about it, and again, I just wanted to state that about like this vitriolic response to somebody saying that, there's just basically a whole world that's waiting right now to accuse other people of being, sensitive or things of that nature, or snowflakes. There's these constant terms being thrown out there time and time again. And it's not that anyone's sensitive, it's that you are being a racist bigot, and that's all there is to it. And somebody's telling you, don't be a bigot, and you're arguing with them. You know what I'm saying? So would it be the same for somebody dealing with somebody who's Jewish dealing with a Nazi? No, it's obvious. That's a racist bigot doing bigoted stuff. And so this response that I want to continue to do the bigoted thing I do, regardless of your opinion and how it affects you and your people, that's the onus really isn't upon us to explain ourselves to them, and they've pretty much said everything they need to say.
It's kind of it's almost a very age-old problem that we as humans seem to suffer throughout generations and generations. I think it was Heraclitus that first theorized this philosophy of impermanence, and why as humans we're so afraid of this impermanence, this idea of change, because at the end of the day, no one wants to feel obsolete, and particularly in the West, where capitalism really has stressed the value of being young and being able to adapt, and how that affects, how ageism and how that affects, how you provide. Of course, there's going to be people that want things to stay the same because they don't want to be put in a position of inferiority. right? And that's a systemic issue psychologically that we have living in the society that we live in. There really is no value in getting older and becoming wiser. You know, it's all about what you can do while you're still young and as an individual. You know, there's no sense of community, no communalism. And so for me, it's not very surprising that there are people that don't want change, because a lot like many things in this day and age, our society enables us to be that way. It's enabled us to stay permanent, to try and remain as an asset to the process as for as long as possible. And you know, you see it with the ranks. You know, it seems that the higher up in seniority that you go inside of a business, the more desperate people are to cling on to power, and they'll do anything, absolutely anything, in order to maintain that status quo. And so I don't think there's really much you can say, we can say, as to people who don't want to change, other than I think now is a deep time for reflection about what it is you're so afraid of. Because as the way that I see it, changing a logo and changing imagery is the least of your worries when it comes to changing things. There's a lot of other things that you need to be worried about when it comes to change. You know, this is like at the bottom of the list. And I think it's for me, no offense, but it's kind of petty, really. I think that's all that really can be said about that. If somebody's asking you to change something because it's hurting them, and that's not going to affect you, what does that say about you? What's that dialogue? What's that inner monologue that you're having with yourself? What does that say about you as a person? And that's the kind of change you should be worried about. Because if you're changing into somebody that's bitter and resentful and so fixated on handling something and holding something that you're squeezing the bare life out of it, then you've got some big issues, some real big issues.
I'd just like to follow on from Nick there, that I feel sorry for these people. I think it reflects on Exeter badly. Maybe, you know, you got to think about how the world is viewing you right now by making this counter protest. As everyone's saying, you're coming across as ignorant and selfish. And, you know, I think in the UK we're lauded for being polite, we're lauded for being a multicultural society, and yet here you are taking us back to an age of intolerance. And it's sad. It really, it's a sad direction that you're potentially taking the people of Exeter down, and the UK, you know, in this day and age of the internet, you know, people are watching, you know, and how do you want to come across as a team, as a city? Yeah, I really ask the people that are making these counter protests have a real deep think of what they're trying to achieve by that.
Yeah, in the words of John Legend, history has its eyes on you. So what side of history do you want to be on?
I mean, that is absolutely correct. Like, what side of history do you want to be on? I want to thank Leandra and Stephanie and Nick for what they're saying, and to this specific, speaking to this specific thing, building off of what Nick was mentioning is I remember when the European Union was an idea, it was a concept. It was something that hadn't existed yet. And then the European Union happened. And then there became a point where the UK said, you know what, we don't want to participate in it anymore. And just recently left, Brexit. That happened easier, quicker, and faster than teams willing to let go of their mascots. What is that saying? What is that saying? Because there are far more ramifications for Brexit, politically, socially, economically, than there is for a sports team. So that's just something to consider.
I think it kind of goes back to you have to look at the root word of fan, which is fanaticism. And when you have fanatics, you know, clinging to something that's kind of this surrogate identity, and they put all this money into it and time and energy, they don't want to let it go. You know, it's the same thing with the Washington team and Kansas City Chiefs. And, you know, you look at a lot of the online commentary, it's like, to them, that's their identity. You know, that is part, it's like they talk about this generational fan base where I was a baby and I wore these jerseys, you know, and it's kind of like, again, it goes back to, well, if sitting there and doing nothing with your life other than rooting for this sports team that probably doesn't even know you exist, then there's deeper things that go beyond that. You know, that's a whole other conversation when you talk about, you know, sports in general and how they're used to, you know, kind of distract the masses, and kind of goes into all these other things about how, you know, sports are used in that manner. But at the same time, it's like, you know, there's this identity that they've manufactured for themselves, and, you know, and it's almost religious and it's, you know, to them, to these fans who are just like, I don't want to let it go. It's a part of who I am, you know. But at the same time, I'm like, you know, we as Native people, a lot of, you know, we're still here. We went through genocide. We actually had our identity torn from us, our land base. Children were sent to boarding schools that have their Native identity beaten out of them, literally. You know, we went through all these different historical atrocities, and we're still going through things today. You can make it through that, a name change. That's nothing compared to what we went through, and you're crying over a name change. You know, we went through all these things. We went through genocide. We went through being stabbed in the back by the United States government in terms of, you know, them making treaties and then not abiding by them. Massacres, you know, just all these things. And we're still here, and we're still trying to fight, you know, to maintain who we are. And you got these people who are just so caught up on this logo, you know, and they can't let that go. So, you know what I'm saying? It's just like, you know, we went through all that and we're still here. But you can't, you know, let that go. And your whole world is crumbling. That just speaks to the, you know, the privilege and everything that they have. You know, if like that is going to stress you out, changing a name for, you know, for the greater good, you know, then what does that say about who you are, you know?
Okay, the next question is, the backlash over the years to big sports teams changing their names and imagery must be exhausting and distressing. How do you take care of yourself and continue to campaign and spread awareness?
For me personally, I'm big on self-care. And I think, especially over here in the United Kingdom, there's a number of different Indigenous issues that come up, and a number of different campaigns that I've been involved in, you know, from missing and murdered Indigenous women to boarding school trauma, residential school trauma, intergenerational trauma, mascots. You know, for me, you know, we can't go and fight every single battle, and on the other hand, you know, there's a part of me that feels, why is it on my shoulders or on our shoulders as Indigenous people to constantly have to educate, you know, especially when we've got so much access to the internet, to Google, to books, to Amazon, whatever it is. And you know, for me, I personally like to keep my energies protected, so I avoid comments a lot of times. You know, on Twitter, I've seen some of the comments with regards to this campaign. I personally don't engage in every single comment that is out there. I think my silence is an answer in itself. And I think oftentimes we as Native people have to take that stance just to protect our own energies and to protect our own spirits, you know, from the negativity, because you can start to take that on, especially when you engage in that kind of activist life, that you can start to turn and become really negative and oppositional and defiant, wanting to argue all the time. So for me, I pick and choose my battles, and that's kind of, you know, for me, part of my self-care, you know, process. I don't feel like I need to fight every fight that's out there. You know, there's other people willing to take that mantle up, and, you know, at the end of the day, education is key, and that starts with self. You know, take the initiative.
You know, I always say to people, because I do a lot of just activism just in general, and I manage, I'm a UK manager for a company called Indigenous Enterprise, which is a traditional dance company, power dance company. And, you know, after a while, it does become a lot, you know, day in, day out, trying to tackle these issues and trying to find my own healing as well, amongst that. But yeah, as I always say, this life isn't for everyone, you know, and part of our resistance really is just existing. The fact that we exist still till this day is the biggest resistance that we have. That's our biggest, really our biggest claim to fame, is that throughout everything we managed to survive all of this. I look back at my ancestors and sometimes I think, boy, the kind of things that they must have gone through comparatively is nothing to what I could be thinking about right now. But then, relatively speaking, I only know my own grief. I only know my own trauma, and I can only deal with that. But sometimes, just moments of reflection, sitting down with myself, talking to other people, talking to my elders, talking to my aunties and uncles across the seas, is enough to just to rejuvenate me, to energize me, and that's important. It's important to not be solitary, and it's also, as much as it is equally important to be solitary and review yourself and evaluate yourself and tell yourself that what you're doing is the right thing to do if you want to commit yourself to it. I made an oath and a commitment to this kind of work that I'm doing. So for me, every moment that I take breath and that I think about what I've been able to achieve is enough to keep me personally. For me, that's me. Really.
Okay, the next question. How much of an impact do you think the murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement, combined with COVID-19 forcing the world to sit still, has had on your efforts fighting for the rights of Indigenous peoples?
One of the things that we have to recognize and realize with the death of George Floyd is we have to recognize that our African brothers and sisters are Indigenous as well. And we have to understand the indigeneity that comes with them and has traveled with them. And although a lot have lost contact, there was a purposeful means of doing so. And so we have to look at the historical account of racism and how it affected their people, often referred to as like slaves, you know. And I grew up in a pretty diverse place in California, in the Bay Area. And so I'm not going to go through this whole thing of like, oh, I had X amount of friends or anything of that nature. But my friends who were Black, I always reminded about the African descent, you know. And I grew up in a pretty cool era when there was a lot of Afrocentric hip hop music, you know, from Stetsasonic to, you know, literally everybody was wearing kente cloths, Queen Latifah, and just continual, you know, that whole effort, you know, growing into like a different world on TV, things of that nature. And so we saw things with like groups like Arrested Development, where the culture was being reintegrated, you know, and the power that came with that, the awareness that came with that birthed people like Lauryn Hill, and things of that nature. So we see that Indigenous spirit still alive, you know, and so when we see the combinations of those worlds, we know, you know, where they come from, what they come from. And so there's a support there because our lives intersect, our struggles intersect. Just like when African people were running away from slave plantations, sometimes they would come across tribes, and those tribes knew who they were dealing with, you know, and were like, they integrated them into the tribe, you know. And the thing is, with what happened through history is we know that we had that commonality. We had that commonality of oppression. And so when we see that, and we see the world focused the way it is, you know, and we see the people are refuting that Black Lives Matter, you know, and to understand the racist nature of police brutality and things of that nature, we suffer right there with them, You know, if you were to look at statistics and number and people that suffer per capita, because again, we have to remember per capita, what that actually means is that, yes, Black and Indigenous people are at the top of the list when it comes to victims of police brutality, leading up to and including murder. With the world focused on those things, this was able to give us pause, you know, and be able to reflect on what was happening, because we didn't have anywhere else to go with the news, with everything that we saw. And it was just the straw that it was the conditions created by colonial force upon George Floyd. And I think that we can all say that watching that and looking at that, we all saw a piece of ourselves in that, and the inhumanity that was in there, and the means of destruction at the hands of a people who don't have any compassion or empathy for the destruction created to our daily lives in so many different facets. We're not just talking about like a physical attack, we're talking about a spiritual attack, an intellectual attack. There are so many ways that we are constantly dealing with this marginalization and this dehumanizing of our being. And so when we look at our brothers and sisters across the globe, you know, I'm fortunate that I have a brother that's from Tibet, you know, and what he deals with and everything that he has to deal with being out here, and people finding those common grounds. Like he actually had a child with a Mohawk woman, you know, and we know that what displacement and dispossession does. And so the things that happened with George Floyd, I happen to be fortunate enough growing up in the Bay Area that I was encouraged by some of the original Black Panthers from Oakland. We'd be at a lot of the same events. And when they saw us showing up as younger people, you know, dressed out and ready to fight for justice, they encouraged us highly. And we're like, hey, brother, hey, sister, hey, so good to see the Indigenous people here. We were welcomed with open arms and educated by them, you know, and you know, there were revolutionaries in the street. And I remember being gifted, you know, the autobiography of Malcolm X by an African brother in Oakland. Well, as I was walking by, he's like, hey, young man, you need to read this. And at the time, I'm you know, to be full disclosure, you know, I wasn't leading the most straight and narrow life, you know, and I know the intent was there, and it was part of my awakening as a human being. And so when we look at these things and we center these things upon what the mechanism is that causes that type of death and destruction and things of that nature, and the public outcry for those types of change, the biggest problem is that they are happening now. We're still continuing to ask for the same things that were asked for by Martin Luther King. And even going further back to Sitting Bull, Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, Nat Turner. You know, this is the discussion that we're having today. Is respect has everything to do with it. That's the first start. That's the first basis of any relationship, is a level of respect. And until people understand that, we're always going to have these problems. And they're going to continue. Because when you can dehumanize someone, it's not so hard to harm them in the worst manner possible.
I think really just the, you know, this combination of events, really, George Floyd, Black Lives Matter, COVID-19, has really opened up a lot of dialogue and conversation for a lot of people. And as somebody who comes from Cuban Caribbean descent, as well as Native American, as well as Indigenous on Turtle Island, you know, I have this kind of a balancing act that I have to participate in a lot of ways, in terms of how I'm conversating with my peers and from either side of my culture, right? And unfortunately, I come from a background, my heritage on both my Native American side, my Mashpee side, and my Caribbean side. They were both slaves, you know. So I'm very much the offspring of slavery. And because of that, I'm very much acutely aware of how the two movements are not, in fact, two movements. They're the same. And I really don't think there's any difference between the George Floyd events and the Black Lives Matter movement, because effectively from the dawn of all of this going down from 400 years ago, plus years ago, the two journeys have been very much intertwined, very much linked. The same events that happen in the same forms of oppression, the same forms of treatment that go across all the cultures of oppressed peoples, especially in the United States. And that really also pretty much extends to all people of color that were involved in building this United States, you know, this with the Latinx community, and and how they are our indigenous brothers as well, brothers and sisters, and also then for the Chinese immigrants who received incredibly harsh treatment as well when they first landed on the shores, just trying to escape their situation, you know, and so on and so forth. And so really, I think actually what's happening is not so much an impact on how it's helped, but actually it's kind of reminded people of how it's always been for us as oppressed minorities fighting together, and how we've always pretty much done that from get-go, because, you know, that's the commonality that we shared, is the trauma and the oppression. And so it's not necessarily it's had a more helpful influence, but it's just reminded us of how integral we are together as a people. Like Christopher says, you know, it's a global community. That's what we are. And it's just a reminder of that. And so I have to balance this of talking to people who are talking about co-opting and optics, and remind them that actually really this whole thing, when we talk together, when we voice together, is so much more beneficial than trying to do it isolated. I think that's the most important thing, really, more than anything.
So the next question is this all about racism, or is it insensitivity?
Again, we're in the 21st century. We're not making excuses for anyone anymore. The onus isn't upon us. The onus isn't upon us to decide whether that's insensitive or racist. You know, we know what it is. You know, if you show up to a party at Halloween in blackface, are you being insensitive or are you being racist? You know, it's clear. It's clear. You know, we're not going to assume that things happen by accident anymore. Oops, I accidentally did something completely racist. You know, just like misogyny. We're not going to excuse misogyny anymore. You weren't being insensitive, you were being misogynistic. That's what was happening. You know, there's no more time for this. When lives are at stake, there's no more time to accept those explanations. We're not even going to entertain it.
And then I have the last question. How does it make you feel to have a group of middle-class white people take offense on your behalf?
Yeah, I got a lot of experience in this one. Unfortunately, you know, being in class growing up in because I was born and raised in Manchester, right? And up there, unfortunately, around the time that I was born, it was just off of the back of the racist riots. And so people were pretty overt and free about how racist they wanted to be towards people of color. And growing up, you know, I had violent experiences, you know, being beaten pretty badly and being bullied. And even from some people from my own, who I would consider to be from my own culture, you know, expressing their own rage and their own trauma through being racist to me. And you know, I'll never forget, it's those moments where you're in class and the teacher says something, or somebody says something overtly racist, and the person that gets up and say, hey, yo, that's racist, you can't say that. And 9 times out of 10, it typically tends to be middle-class white person. And, you know, it's a bittersweet reality of our position, because it speaks to the privilege of which a middle-class white person can have. And I always say that actually, really, the middle-class people are the invention of middle-class people is a very recent thing, and it's important because it bridges the gap between, when maintained, it bridges the gap between the upper class and what is considered to be the lower class, if you believe that class even really exists as something. They have a lot of power because they're not too far separated from from lower class, working class, poor people in terms of their experiences, and also at the same time they're not overtly divided from the upper class, and so it's in a lot of ways they're very important to act as the middleman or middle woman, and so it's a bittersweet feeling knowing that coming from the position that I come from, or that we come from, is actually, we want to be the ones that go up and get up and say, hey, yo, you can't say that, that's racist. But the actuality of the matter is, when we do that, most of the time, no one listens. And this is proof in the pudding, really. You know, this whole situation, the whole Washington Redskins situation, and the whole Black Lives Matter movement and police brutality, years and years and years, hundreds of years, we've been standing up and trying to say, hey, look, what you're doing is harming us. It's prejudice, it's discrimination. You're intentionally being hostile towards us because of the color of our skin or our culture or how long our hair is or whatever, or the language that we speak. And yet it's taken this long for people to listen. But I can guarantee you that if somebody who's got a bit of money and whose complexion is a lot lighter than mine decides to say something, oh, they're gonna listen. 100% they're gonna listen, because really, let's face it, in this society, economy is value, economy is worth. And if you're somebody that can make a statement through economy, you've got power. And unfortunately, in a position that we are in as people of color, as oppressed minorities, we do not have economic flourish, and therefore we do not have voice unless we have peers that can voice for us. And that is the paradigm that always appears when it comes to allyship with people of color and white people not of color. So it's a difficult question. Yes, I take offense, but it's not because I'm offended by the fact that they feel like they need to stand up and say something for me. I'm more offended by the fact that I can't get up and say something without fear of repercussion. And that's the bittersweet paradigm that exists in modern day Western capitalist society and allyship. I think really that's a massive crux in this situation, really, that we're in.
So for me, I just wanted to kind of highlight, you know, in relation to this campaign, for me, I think we mentioned it previously in our conversation that we as Natives experience relative invisibility. And this was coined by Crystal Alcohawk's report in the, you know, people don't see us as being real and lived cultures, living people. And because we do have this invisibility, there's not a lot of representation in media. So when you think of us here in the United Kingdom, we experience even greater invisibility. So for me personally, I really rely on that, you know, on our allies, those that are, you know, opening up space and providing platforms for us, who are actually passing the mic and are willing to stand in the background and allow our voices to be heard. Those are people that I choose to align with. And I think you probably realized, Alex, when you first approached me and told me about this campaign, because I kind of knew about it. I knew it was bubbling away under the surface. And for me, I'm always very careful as far as the people that I choose to ally, be involved with, and when I got to meet you guys and to speak with you guys, I recognized that you guys had actually done the research. You actually did your homework. You educated yourselves. You guys brought to the table an educated understanding of why this is offensive. And what I found really interesting was that you guys were also fans. This was a rugby club that you guys, adore and you love. And it was just this, this utter disappointment around why they've had to culturally misappropriate our culture. And so for me, after that first meeting, it was very evident and clear to me that your allyship had gone beyond that kind of performative allyship or optical allyship. It was really a meaningful exchange where you were actually coming to the table and saying, look, we find this offensive as fans of Exeter Chiefs, and we want to highlight your voice. We want to highlight the Indigenous voices because we've done our homework. We understand what Indigenous voices are saying out there. And I guess for me, moving forward in a lot of the relationships that I've established here in the United Kingdom, it has been around, this mutual respect and understanding, people who are educated as to why these issues are ongoing, why it is my people are oppressed, or even people of color are being oppressed, and marginalized. And so for me, I heavily rely on allies like yourself, like other people that I work with throughout my educational and awareness raising campaigns and things that I work with. So for me, that's an important aspect as far as creating change, creating awareness here in the United Kingdom, because again, we represent an even greater minority. So we really do need more people who are willing to ally with us and provide space for us to speak our own truths.
I'd like to say a really big thank you on behalf of the Exeter Chiefs for Change team to Leandra, Tony, Nick, Stephanie, Jimmy, and Christopher for giving their time to be a part of this important discussion.
So first of all, I'd like to highlight some of these allies that I work with. I am a board member for Incomindios UK, which is a human rights organization. We've got some work that we're doing around missing and murdered Indigenous women. So we'll be doing a webinar, hopefully coming up in the fall. So if you can keep an eye out for that, we've got all social media platforms in Incomindios UK. I'm also a board member for Beyond the Spectacle, Native North American Presence in Britain. These are another group of allies that I work with who do a lot towards raising awareness around missing and murdered Indigenous women, Indigenous Peoples' presence here in Britain, and a lot of research around mascots and Native imagery. And one last organization, Omaha Tribal Historical Research Project. That's a project that I'm on the board of directors with. A lot of information around Omaha people, Native people. So if you want to access any information on who we are, educate yourself, there are organizations out there to do that. You can find us on all social media platforms and online.
Basically, I just wanted to express my gratitude to everybody for sharing their wisdom, knowledge, and experience with the rest of us so openly. So I'm grateful to all of you for everything that you've gone through, for everything that you fight for everything that you stand for everything you've survived as human beings and Indigenous peoples on this continent. The fact that we're still doing this in this day and age, it's worthwhile work, but hopefully there's a time where we put ourselves out of business, so to speak. I would love to do something other than this stuff all the time. I'd love to just be social.
Absolutely. Check out his music. He's good.
Yeah, so I'm part of Leandra's group, the Native UK, and I think we are taking this forward. We are targeting other UK-based sports teams. So I'm currently working with the guys on that project. And I'd just like to say thank you very much for this evening. It's been a great honor to be with you guys and talking sharing our experiences, and I hope this brings change, much needed change.
So we are a group of Indigenous people who are living here in the UK. We represent, I think there's about 15 of us from 15 different nations throughout the United States, Canada. Stephanie's obviously from, her people come from Alaska. But yes, there's another campaign that we're sort of chasing up. Whitley Bay women's ice hockey team, known by the Whitley Bay Squaws, which is actually a more derogatory term for us as Native people. That we're looking to come after next. So watch this space. We've just sent some information over to them today, I believe. Wasn't that right, Nick?
Yeah, just sent a wordy email over to the chairman. Hopefully he's gonna respond soon. Just to check out Indigenous Enterprise, which is the touring powwow company that I represent as a manager and a facilitator here in the UK. Unfortunately, because of coronavirus, it's messed up a lot of things for us as a company. But I did have plans in motion to do a research and development phase that was supposed to happen in May, and then come November we were going to do a UK tour, which was basically just to share and educate people in the cultural ways of our dances and how powwows work, and really just expose people to our very existence still as a people, and get some global recognition. We recently did Sydney Opera House as a group, and we have plans to go over to the rest of Europe and continue to do what we're doing. So Indigenous Enterprise, we'll go to the Instagram page, got a web page as well. Check that out. Also, Mashpee Wampanoag tribe-nsn.gov. That is the tribe's website. Recently, the US government tried to take our land from us. It was a violation of their own regulations. Surprise, surprise. It was another treaty broken, but this time they were called out about it, and so that didn't happen. But unfortunately, we've now been subpoenaed for financial records. So historically, as a tribe, we were the first to meet the English settlers when they came over, and so ever since then we've had some very interesting, long-winded issues when it comes to our settler neighbors, apparently. So any support just by looking at the website, any petitions that send out, on my Instagram page, Nicholas James Orlando as well. I'll always post up petitions and ways to support and organize and stuff like that. So be much appreciated.
Thank you. So finally, I'd like to invite everyone that's watching this to make sure they're following Exeter Chiefs for Change on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram to see what we're doing to further this campaign, and to please continue to sign and share our petition. Thank you very much.